Hello, future India here from the editing room. Just to let you know that this was my first time ever recording an episode through Zoom, and it was all going swimmingly until for some reason it switched from my main microphone to my AirPods microphone. So you might notice a little way through the episode that the audio quality on my end of things isn't so great. I am sorry. Your girl just clearly doesn't know how to use technology, and I do apologise, but it's still a great episode. There's still loads of amazing stuff in there, and you'll hear some great things from Missy. And also just to let you know that this is a two-parter, and I will be releasing the second part of this episode next week, so you won't have to wait too long for that. And finally, I don't want to take up too much of your time because I know you wanted to get to the actual content of this episode, but the day that I release this episode is August 6th, and that marks exactly 1 year to the day that I released my very first episode of Ladies of Law. And I just wanted to say a gigantic thank you to every single person that has listened, everyone that's commented. You have made my day every day for 365 days now. I did do a bit of a longer post on the Patreon and on the Discord about this, but I just wanted to quickly, before the episode starts, say thank you, I appreciate you, and I can't wait to see what the next year brings. Okay, let's get going. Hello and welcome to Ladies of Law, the podcast where we take all of the most wonderful women of mythology and folklore and we unpick, unravel and explore their origins, their stories and how they've changed through time to arrive in today's modern world. I'm India and I am so grateful to have you here with me today. If you are new to the podcast, welcome on in. I really hope you enjoy it here, and if you do, please feel free to follow or subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. Leave me a little comment or a review if you can, and you can follow me over on Blue Sky or TikTok, and I have a Patreon where I post little bits and pieces. On that note, I will be doing a video Q&A over there to all members, free and paid. So if you have any questions you'd like for me to answer, please comment them on this episode if your platform allows, or you can ask them over on TikTok, Blue Sky, Patreon or Discord. I think that's everything. Now, this week we are headed once again back into the world of Disney, but this time we're not alone. I'm so excited to be joined this week by Missy, who is a folklorist and frequent guest on the What the Force podcast. So what I'm going to do is hand it over to Missy to tell you a little bit more about herself and her interests in folklore. So hello, Missy. I'll pass it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm super excited. Thank you. So basically I've just kind of always been a folklore and fairy tale fan. In particular, I have a background in illustration. And so what I've done over the years is collect a lot of illustrated children's books of different fairy tales. And there came a moment where I sort of realized, hey, these two stories seem very similar. I wonder why that is. And that led me to then dive deep into the world of comparative mythology. And I just learned a lot then about the different tale types, ended up collecting a lot of different collections of tale types. So in this case, maybe Sleeping Beauty or Snow White. I know you talked about Cinderella recently.
I did, yeah.
And yeah, really love digging into all of the unique versions of those stories and how they reflect the culture that they come from, etc. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I got here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you here with me today. I know we had a very brief chat. This has been in the works for a while, and then I got poorly, and we were off doing. I think you went. Did you go on a holiday? Did you go?
I briefly, yeah.
Yeah. So we had some things. So it's been in the works for a while. So I'm really happy that we're finally sitting down and doing this because, like I said, we're diving back into the Disneyverse, and we're talking about another tale like Cinderella, which is a lot older than I think people realise. It's one that's crossed borders and genres and centuries, and that is the story of Snow White. And I know that you have some really cool things to talk about. So the format for today is going to be pretty similar to what I usually do, but Missy, like I said to you before we started recording, please feel free to jump in at any point because I know you've got lots of good things in your brain and I would like to hear them all. I would also say that Missy and I are going to have another chat specifically about disability representation in fairy tales and folklore, and this will be available to Patreon not so long after this episode is released. So if you enjoy this episode, you'll be pleased to know that there's going to be more, and you can go and check that out over on Patreon using all the info in the show notes. So I think we've sort of done the introductions, and I think it's about time we cracked on and talked all things Snow White, although my laptop has just told me it's going to go to sleep because I didn't plug it in. So just bear with me 1 second. You guys can hear that. Okay.
It's the authentic experience.
It is. We are keeping it real over here, keeping it 100. Though most people associate Snow White with the 1937 Disney classic, her roots reach far deeper into the oral storytelling traditions of pre-modern Europe. The origins of Snow White reach far further back than its most well-known version by the Brothers Grimm. While the Grimm version, which we will absolutely come on to, cemented the story for modern audiences, many of the story's thematic and narrative elements are traceable to far older traditions. The tale's core structure, centering on a young woman of exceptional beauty persecuted by a jealous maternal figure and later rescued or preserved by supernatural agents or beings, appears in numerous cultural settings, often embodying localized social, spiritual, and symbolic meanings. In Indo-European mythological traditions, we find precursors to Snow White both in oral folklore and mythic literature. The ancient Greek myth of Persephone, for instance, shares the motif of a beautiful maiden's symbolic death and resurrection. Persephone is taken into the underworld by Hades and must remain there part of the year because she eats a pomegranate seed, which is a little reminiscent of Snow White's fatal bite of the apple. Both fruit-eating episodes mark transitions from innocence to entrapment, from being alive to slipping into a liminal state somewhere between life and death. And plenty of scholars have observed that the fruit is not just a symbol of temptation, but also of transformation, one that binds the heroine to a new condition. We've just had some fruity tales here on the podcast, most recently in our episode with RPG Major, so fruit is absolutely a widespread symbol of temptation and transformation. Need I even mention Eve and the Garden of Eden? And then we also have ancient Iranian folklore, which is also preserved through oral transmission and later recorded in various Persian texts. These also feature tales of persecuted princesses whose beauty is a curse as well as a gift. In the Shahnameh, which is the Book of Kings, we encounter figures such as Rudabeh and other heroines whose unmatched beauty invites danger and whose fates are manipulated by jealous rivals. Composed just post-medieval, so we're going a little bit further ahead than medieval here, the motifs derive from older Zoroastrian and pre-Islamic mythological structures. And these heroines often experience exile, persecution, confinement due to their physical appearance and the jealousy it provokes. And these are things that are instantly recognisable when we're thinking about Snow White. In the early Sanskrit work, The Ocean of the Streams of Story, which is a compendium of Indian folk tales compiled in about the 11th century, but based on much earlier material, we find narratives involving evil stepmothers and persecuted daughters. One tale recounts a beautiful girl whose stepmother is so envious of her appearance that she sends her into the forest under false pretenses to have her killed. The executioner spares her life, the girl is protected by forest spirits, and this structure is pretty much identical to the early versions of Snow White recorded by the Grimms and their contemporaries, suggesting that this motif of a wicked stepmother of the forest as a site of transformation and the ultimate vindication of the heroine is a deeply shared plot device. And to take you back a little bit to the episode that we did on Cinderella, if you remember, there are similar motifs in the Ye Shan story, wherein a girl of great beauty is tormented by her stepmother and forced into servitude. Though the tale ends with magical aid and eventual recognition of her worth by a royal figure, so it's given Cinderella there, it still shares many themes with Snow White, including female rivalry, transformation via suffering, and reward through moral virtue and beauty. And when Missy and I first spoke about making this episode, one of the things that you said to me, Missy, was about a West African Snow White-esque tale with a little bit of a queer twist, because we like that around here. And I've been really excited to hear about that ever since. I didn't do any research on that part of it because I wanted to hear it fresh from you. So I'm going to pass it over to you now to tell us all about that.
Yeah, I'm excited. So just to back up a little bit, what you just described about the history of Snow White and its relation to several other stories, I want to specify really how Snow White differs from other Sleeping Beauty tales. Because they are technically the same tale type in that the sleeping princess is sort of the key piece there, the princess who goes into a death-like state, as you mentioned, and then ultimately emerges. And so it's those things you mentioned. It's the evil, jealous mother figure. It is the escape to the forest, which is the place of transformation. It is typically she is protected by a group of people or creatures. So dwarves, robbers, fairies, whatever the case may be. And then there's another feature, which is often the special coffin. So once she dies or falls asleep, then because she is not decaying, her keepers choose to put her inside some kind of special coffin. There's a glass coffin, there's a gold coffin, there's whatever, all different kinds. And then ultimately she emerges. And so it's maybe the fruit, as you said, is taken out of her throat. There's actually a story with a grape as well. So any number of different fruits we have there. But then also the sort of needle of the Sleeping Beauty story also appears in many Snow White variations. So it might be the piece of flax, which is then, pierces her and is drawn out. Or it might be a rusty nail, which is, in many cases inserted into her head and then drawn out. So there's all these different cases where she then emerges and, meets the lover and then lives happily ever after, so to speak. And so with knowing that these are the features of a Snow White tale, I want to point out what's missing just before we get into the story itself, which is, well, what's the title we know best from the Grimms? Snow White. We know that refers to her skin. And so there is a racial element to the story as it is best known in the Western world. And so what's interesting about that is understanding that is quite specific to these versions, like the Disney version. That actually has nothing to do with the tale type itself. So if you dive into different Snow White variations, many of them do not reference skin or color at all. So it's very interesting. And at the same time, because stories like the one I'm about to share from West Africa were typically recorded by colonizers, there then is kind of an implicit racial element that they are bringing to the story. So that is really, really important to understand when we get into this, because it can be quite difficult to tease out what are the elements that are being projected from white colonizers onto these tales and what are the authentic elements coming from indigenous populations.
Yeah, that is really interesting, and interesting that you say that, because after we've done this, I'm going to talk a little bit about medieval sort of versions of the tale and how the historical, social, political, and especially religious context of the time has an effect on the tale. And part of that is about the skin, the blood, the blood red lips, the black hair, and the tricolour sort of motif. So it's really interesting. I'm really interested to hear that you say that, because I've found similar things in my research. It's definitely a thing.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating. So where this story comes from is I have a collection of Sleeping Beauty and Snow White tales from around the world, edited by Heidi Ann Heiner. This is one of my favorite collections. She does lots and lots of collections of different fairy tales. She always gives her sources. So if you want to go hunt down the original, or, if you are looking for a different translation, you can always find them. But this is always a good starting point for me to discover tales and then dive deeper. And so this story, the title she gave it, again, most folk tales don't really have a title per se. They're just sort of oral folklore, and then somebody one day writes it down and gives it a title. But the title that she gives this is The Beautiful Daughter, sources West Africa. And in particular, this comes from a collection which was Fetishism in West Africa, published in 1904 by, I don't know if I can pronounce, Nassau is the person's name. And he claims that the story is, at the time of publishing, so 1904, probably 200 to 250 years old. And he says this because of some of the features of the story, which indicate that they did come from the Portuguese colonizers of West Africa at the time. So with that as the context, the story starts off fairly familiar. It is a king's daughter who has a magical mirror. And she looks into the mirror every day, asks who's the fairest, says you are. She loves that. Eventually, she has a daughter, and She is afraid as the daughter grows older that the daughter will become more beautiful than her. But she won't ever hear this from the mirror unless the mirror looks upon her daughter. So she specifically tries to keep her daughter from seeing the mirror. She prevents her from going into the room where she does her toilet. And so one day, the daughter, who gets tired of being kept from this room, waits until the mother has gone out and sneaks into the room and looks in the mirror. And the mirror says, "Oh, what a beautiful girl." And she leaves. Later, the mother comes home and looks into the mirror, asks who's the fairest, and the mirror says, "There is someone fairer than you." And so then the mother, yes, I know.
Oh no.
The mother asks her daughter, "Did you go in that room?" And she's like, "No, I didn't do that."
Don't know what you're talking about.
I know. She goes in the next day and does it again. So this happens 3 times until she is caught. And then the mother, sends her with the two huntsmen into the woods, tells them to kill her. They can't. And so they tell her to flee into the forest. They kill 2 dogs in her stead and present them to the mother. And she ends up with a group of robbers. She keeps house for them, all your typical things. And eventually, the mother discovers that she's alive and tells a friend, "Hey, I want you to go to where she is, and I want you to kill her." So the friend of the mother goes, finds the daughter, and pushes a nail into her head. And so she... Ooh. I know, it's pretty awful.
Very grim.
It is. Falls down as if dead. The robbers discover her. They're devastated, but she's not deteriorating. And so they choose to put her into a gold coffin and they keep her. Eventually, a rich man, I think his servant comes and discovers the gold coffin and brings the rich man and says, "Look at this gold coffin. It's amazing." And he just leaves with it. So there's no negotiating with the robbers or anything. He just takes it.
Just takes it.
It just takes it and doesn't actually look inside until he gets home. And then he looks inside and sees the girl, but she does not awaken. He's just like, "Oh, what a beautiful girl. This is so sad. Oh, she looks like she's a similar age for my daughter. She would be a really good companion for my daughter. It's such a shame that she's dead." And so he puts her away and tells the daughter not to enter the room where she is.
Oh, well, we can guess what's going to happen. I know. We can guess.
That daughter eventually is, "Why can't I go in that room?" So she goes in. She opens the coffin, discovers the girl, and is like, "Oh, you're so beautiful. Can I touch your hair?" And so she's sort of like stroking her head, discovers the nail and pulls it out. The girl awakens.
Wow.
And so I think this is where I want to actually read it because this is important. So then the girl asked, "Where am I? What place is this?" The other said, "Why, you are in my father's house. This is my father's house." And the girl asked, "But who or what brought me here?" Then Ogula's daughter told her the whole story of Esserengila's having found the gilded box. They at once conceived a great liking for each other and started to be friends. They played and laughed and talked and embraced and fondled each other. They did this for quite a while. Then the beautiful one was tired and she said, "It is better that you put back the nail and let me sleep again." So the girl lay down in the box, the nail was inserted into her head, and she instantly fell into unconsciousness. So these two became lovers when they awakened. And so it goes on to talk about how then the daughter leaves. Of course, the father, "Did you go in that room?" "No, I didn't do that." She comes back.
We never learn.
She comes back in each day and reawakens her lover. It says that they continue to be companions, and then discovers that she will become stronger if she feeds her. So each day that she visits, she brings her food and she becomes a little stronger. So there, even though that's not a fruit motif, you do start to get this, eating the food of the other brings you into their world. And so eventually then they are discovered. And so I believe that what happens is they trick the mother into coming, and they end up, I don't think they kill her. I think they just banish her. But ultimately, the rich man ends up marrying her so that she can continue to be the companion of his daughter. And the ending is the daughter and the girl living happily ever after.
Wow, that is so kind of openly queer, which is which is really wild to me.
Yeah. I think, and that's what fascinates me about this is, again, keep in mind the context here is that this is, we know that there are colonizing elements to the story. It's very difficult to tease them apart. But given the fact that this is in a collection of so-called fetishism, it seems to me like the queer elements are likely the most authentic. If there's similarities to some European versions of Snow White, then it's likely that those elements maybe are more, some of the colonial elements. But the queer story does seem to be original. And so it's really fascinating because to your point, it's not subtle. It explicitly says that the reason that the man marries her is so that she can stay with his daughter. So I just think it's a really fascinating story. And what really struck me when I read it for the first time was I've never seen this anywhere. I've never seen this in, collections of queer fairy tales. I just thought it was really fascinating. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, it really is. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think, like you say, it's not something that I don't think I've ever come across anything so openly queer. And even the father marrying her just to keep her there for his daughter. Yeah, that's such a compassionate move.
And that was his intent from the beginning. Because remember, when he first looked upon her, he was like, she would be such a good companion for my daughter. Yeah, and it's remarkable. It's beautiful. It's so interesting because so many of the Sleeping Beauty variations, they can be quite upsetting. Absolutely. Sometimes there's, assault while she's still asleep or whatever. And so to see that just the complete opposite of that, just pure love from the start, it's really extraordinary. I also really love that these two girls have personalities. They both are defiant of the parent, which I thought was really interesting. And you also get to see the way the different parents react. You have one which is like, I'm gonna kill you, and the other which said, you know what, I will make sure that you can stay with your lover forever. It's fascinating. It's
that's really, really cool. And for anyone that wants to read that story in full, I'll make sure that I get all the information and put it in the show notes so you can have a proper read of that. But it's definitely clear to see that tales reminiscent of Snow White that we know and love today reach so far back across centuries, continents, cultures. And that is the same as what I said last time with Cinderella. And now we know some of these early versions, I think it's probably a good idea to explore how they changed over time. During the medieval period, the story elements that would later come together into Snow White that we know circulated in a variety of forms throughout European folklore and literature, embedded within social, religious and political ideologies of the time. And while, like you said, there's no text directly titled Snow White, the narrative structure, tropes and the moral configurations associated with it were highly prevalent in the stories of saints in chivalric romances, moral exemplar and courtly literature. And these early incarnations of the tale motifs, so the persecuted innocence, female envy, beauty as both a virtue and a peril, death-like sleep, preservation and eventual redemption, functioned within a cultural matrix that was deeply patriarchal and shaped by religious authority. One of the most pertinent medieval parallels to Snow White can be found in the genre of hagiography, which is the biography of the lives of saints. And there are quite a few that specify the lives of female virgin martyrs. And these types of narratives, they often featured young women who were marked by their extraordinary beauty, which provokes either lust or envy of male authority figures or of older women. And there's a really good example of this in the Golden Legend, which was compiled in the 13th century. Saints, you've got saints in there like St. Agnes and St. Dymphna. And they are depicted as these sort of paragons of innocence and beauty who face massives of persecution from authority figures, including their own family members, due to their refusal to conform to social expectations, most especially when it comes to marriage or sexual availability. So you've got these beautiful women that don't want to get married, that don't want to give their body to a man. And their resistance leads to death, whether that's actual death or a symbolic death. But miraculously, their bodies remain incorrupt. They don't decay, they don't rot. And that echoes exactly what you said about this idea of a coffin, the glass coffin, the golden coffin. And in the Golden Legend, there's an entry on St. Cecilia, which I'll read, and that definitely mirrors this sort of preservation motif. And it says, her body was untouched by decay, a sign of her sanctity. So yeah, it's definitely a big thing, this beautiful woman that provokes all of this envy and anger and frustration, and then her body is kept in its perfect state.
Yeah. And I want to point out also, because I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding. A lot of times when people try to sort of modernize fairy tales, they'll project certain modern sensibilities onto it. And that's okay, but it's good to also understand what was actually happening in and I know there's no original per se, but what is happening in some of the early oral folklore. And so this repeating motif of beauty, as to your point, both something to be admired and also potentially something that can cause threat, it's because beauty in patriarchy, feminine beauty in patriarchy, is power. It is a source of power. And so it is important to understand when we're reading these stories and we read, oh, they're beautiful. Oh, well, that's not something they can control, or that's not, why would we look at the outside and not the inside? Quite often beauty it's literally a symbol of feminine power. And so anytime you read one of these stories or you're looking at a retelling or whatever, if you interpret it that way and say that she was envied for her power, it's a better way of understanding what's really happening in the story and why she is so targeted, because that's what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. And also being beautiful during the medieval period wasn't just sort of an aesthetic thing. It also held moral and theological weight. To be beautiful was a sign of divine favour or spiritual purity. But like you say, to the shock of literally nobody listening to this podcast, it's also a sign of temptation and danger, especially when you are a beautiful woman. And we all know that this description of Snow White with her skin whiter than snow, lips redder than blood, and hair black as ebony, it's building especially in medieval times, this picture of a perfectly beautiful woman that's exactly as she should look. And isn't it so strange to think that although she's looking exactly as she should look as this idealized woman, it's still not okay. It's like women just can't win. I mean, we knew that anyway, but you know. And also, like I said earlier, these colours, they correspond with medieval triadic colour symbolism, where white signified chastity, red signified the vitality of life and sometimes martyrdom, and black signified the unknowable or protected sanctity of the soul. And that motif appears in a lot of different medieval bestiaries and in sermons. And so for all of those qualities to come together in one woman was very triggering for people, I think.
Yeah.
And if you think back to other episodes where we've discussed the medieval period, the portrayal of feminine beauty as both a gift and a threat is pretty consistent. And I found a really good quote that made me laugh, but it's also really indicative of just the vibe of the time when it came to views on women. And it's in the writings of St. Jerome. And he warned that woman is the gate of the devil. I don't know how you feel about that. I'm going to just own being the gate of the devil. I'm quite happy to be the gate.
I'll take it.
Devil.
Yeah,
I'll take it. I'll take it. And also find the role of the stepmother or jealous older woman in medieval courtly and didactic literature. And she often serves as a symbol of carnal vice or envy, which is one of the 7 deadly sins, or the perils of female rivalry in polygamous or hierarchical households. In Melusine, which is a 14th century French prose, female betrayal and secret identity are sort of wrapped and intermingled in supernatural motifs. You've got older women acting as gatekeepers or destroyers of youthful innocence. Envy between women was moralised a lot in conduct books and moral stories as a source of spiritual danger and social chaos. And moral tales that were told by medieval preachers warned people of the destructive effects of female envy, often by sort of invoking these allegorical figures that represented the virtues and vices.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a really good tale called The Castle of Perseverance from 1425. And in that tale, all of the vices were personified like envy and pride, and they come together and conspire to destroy the soul of mankind, which sort of echoes the idea that a beautiful maiden is threatening, and not just to human weakness, but there's actually sort of more of a cosmic moral drama, you know, that can literally bring down the soul of mankind when you've got a beautiful woman, because she has that much power just by being a beautiful woman.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also that the idea of that power, and how within patriarchy, feminine power is limited. And so this idea that women find themselves sort of fighting for scraps, and that's where sort of the rivalry comes from, is that there's only so much feminine power to go around within this system, and so it ends up pitting the old and the young against one another, or rivals. A lot of times in these stories you'll get the sisters who are rivals for a man's affection or something like that. So yeah, you see a lot of this.
And then you have the forest, which is a central setting in Snow White, and this was understood in the medieval imagination as a liminal and sacred space. In folklore and religious allegory, the forest functioned in many ways. It's a place of trial, it's a place of purification, it's a place of exile. In Yvain by Chrétien de Troyes in the late 12th century, the hero enters a mysterious forest, undergoes some trials that all lead to self-discovery and spiritual transformation. You got other legends like St. Euphrosyne. A woman disguises herself as a man and flees into a forest monastery to escape an unwanted marriage, embodying the transformation and concealment powers that the woods possess in tales like Snow White. Forests in medieval cosmology could shelter, they could provide a place of danger, they could provide a place of sanctuary, and for a female figure like Snow White, they served as places of death and rebirth. There, she was socially removed from human law, and she was in a space where divine or magical intervention could occur. Now, I know everyone's probably thinking, what about the dwarfs? Where are the dwarfs? Well, unfortunately, they were probably not around in medieval times. They don't really have a very clear medieval equivalent. They might have come from earlier European mythologies, like Germanic and Norse traditions, where dwarfs were sort of beings of the underworld. They were guardians of underground treasure, very skilled in their crafts. And their presence in Snow White might reflect residual medieval folklore where females are protected by supernatural or marginal male figures, a bit like desert fathers or ascetic monks in saints' lives who aid the fleeing female martyr. The connection for that, though, it's not overly strong, but it's significant enough to mention. And the role of the dwarfs in Snow White mirror this guardianship and moral labour assigned to monastic communities in the terms of protecting female virtue.
I've read some things that suggest that the Grimms themselves, weren't sure whether to include Snow White in their collection at first because it was not really a Germanic tale. And when they opted to include it, they specifically pulled in elements like some of the Sleeping Beauty elements, like from Brunhild and things like that, because they wanted to make it more Germanic. So so this is also possibly part of it, is that it was sort of retroactively cobbled together from
that's what I read sources as well. That it was a case of, how can we link this to what we're trying to do here?
How do we make this more German? Add dwarfs. Okay.
Add dwarfs. Now dwarfs are German, everybody. Every dwarf you ever come across, German in any book.
Nope.
The theme of death and resurrection, which is kind of pivotal in Snow White, also obviously held profound theological weight in medieval society. The doctrine of transubstantiation, which is the belief that during Mass, the bread and the wine literally is the blood and body of Christ, even though they still look and taste the same, along with the veneration of incorruptible bodies of saints and the very Christian emphasis on bodily resurrection.
these are all things that shaped medieval ideas of death. And medieval people didn't necessarily see death as an endpoint, but more of an in-between state.
Mm-hmm.
Snow White's glass coffin, Snow White's sleep-like death, and her eventual awakening all are very, very reflective of this Christian iconography. Even the Virgin Mary herself was often called the mirror of justice, and she was also considered this paragon of beauty, chastity, and mercy, and an ideal medieval woman whose attributes are mirrored in Snow White, but in a very secularized and folkloric type of way.
She actually makes an appearance. I just want to mention she does. Just real quick, the Virgin Mary actually makes an appearance in one of the Snow White variations. There's one where she is taken into the forest by her mother, and her mother has food and water with her, but will not give any to Snow White. And Snow White begs and begs, and then she says, if you cut out your eye, I'll give you food. And so she does. So she cuts out one eye, and then she begs and begs for water. She says, if you cut out your other eye, I'll give you water. She begs and begs. And so then she leaves her without eyes in the forest. And eventually she comes upon the Virgin Mary, whose tears then regrow her eyes. So she actually is a character in at least one Snow White story.
That's amazing. Oh, thank you for that. So, the religious undertones of Snow White, her death and her death and her rebirth, they would not have been lost on a medieval audience. A medieval audience would have ate that up. That's so telling of the time that we're talking about here. Medieval audiences were like low-key obsessed with the cycle of suffering and death and resurrection. And this the Snow White tale and Snow White-esque tales, that's what they wanted. That's the theology in action. So while medieval versions of the Snow White story never existed in a unified way, many of its narrative elements were found across religious texts, romances, folklore, and literature. And the motifs were not static, but they were very much culturally dynamic. They were shaped by all of these anxieties about gender and virtue and power and how fragile the human body and soul is. The tales were designed to give moral instruction, to give some social commentary and religious reflection. And they weren't just entertainment. They were also ways to sort of navigate this complex ideological world. And the medieval foundations of Snow White were very deeply entwined with the intellectual and spiritual landscape at the time. So the tale was not just a story for children, but it was a bit of a manuscript for medieval European consciousness. I've spoken quite a lot about the themes in Snow White in this little bit, but there are some that I know, Missy, you've picked out as well. Ones that I haven't really covered yet, which is dismemberment and disability. And before we go on to talk about the Grimm version of the tale, I thought I'd hand it over to you to hear what you had to say about those themes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that the example that I just gave a minute ago is a great example here of what you sometimes see in these stories. Again, that was a character that she had to pull out her own eyes in the story, and then they are regrown. And that shows basically how this motif often appears in stories in general, but especially in the Snow White story, and the problems with it, frankly, and when we're dealing with the question of disability in story. And so what you have is when Snow White, whether she eats the apple or she gets a nail inserted to her head or whatever the case may be, when this happens to her, that is a form of psychic dismemberment. And so if you like Women Who Run with the Wolves, this is covered in the Silver Hands story, the handless maiden, in which her hands are cut off by the devil, or by her father on the orders of the devil. And then she wanders for years, has all these adventures, and ultimately the hands are regrown. And the idea is that in some way she is separated from knowledge. So symbolically, she is lacking in knowledge. So the character of Snow White falling asleep, she is lacking in knowledge. She is, held in ignorance. That is her death-like state, is that she is prevented from knowing something that allows her to be a fully whole and complete person. And the idea being that when the lover awakens her, then this is giving her the full knowledge of her world and herself in order to become a complete person and ultimately be a partner then to the lover. And so it's as a psychological journey, that's what's happening. But the problem with using dismemberment and disability in a symbolic way is that it objectifies the disabled body. It only exists to teach a lesson as opposed to what it really is in reality, right? Which is just different bodies, all as we have throughout history and all over the world. And so what is very challenging about some of these stories is that these are recurring motifs. You're going to see them all over the place. We have famously, of course, the example I gave, blindness, which is then healed. Well, for the vast majority of people, blindness is just how they live. It's not, it's not healing. And there's no idea of, oh, they're broken and they're going to be fixed. Like, no, it's just another way.
That's just how they live in. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so this is the really kind of big issue I think you see when you study these stories is it's important to understand what is happening in the story and also how that contains all of our biases and our prejudices that we have. And obviously the same is true in the Snow White story when it comes to race, is that you can't separate certain versions of the story from the racial implications. So that's kind of the main thing I find when I look into Snow White stories specifically is you get the intersection with, the disability and the racial context that, I think should always be discussed openly when we're talking about these stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting that you point that out because when you, especially with fairy tales, somebody being disabled often ends up with them being healed because they've done something right or they've
right.
It's almost like a reward to be healed. But the reality is that that's not reality, And then on the inverse of that, you have it a lot of the time, and I did speak about this in the Cinderella episode, where somebody is given a disability as a punishment.
Yeah.
So there's no somebody just happens to have a disability. It's always something that either is to be overcome and the reward is that's taken away, or that disability is given as a punishment. So it's really interesting that disability is not portrayed as is, like you say. There's been disabled people all over the world, all throughout history. And where are the stories of people just living their lives who happen to have a disability? And I know we're going to go on to talk more about this in a bit more detail for our separate posts over on Patreon. So if you are interested and you are hearing this little mini discussion and want to hear more about it, please do go and have a little listen.
And with that, I am going to wrap up part 1 of this exploration into Snow White. I really hope that you enjoyed the episode, and I am once again so sorry that the AirPods mic took over a little bit. It is like that a little bit in the next episode, but it does end up going back to my main microphone, so just hang in there because there's so much good stuff to learn about Snow White in the next episode, and I really appreciate you hanging in there and listening regardless of my terrible ability to record things. If you have enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to follow or subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. Leave me a little comment if your platform allows it. It does really genuinely make my day. Or a review. This all helps to get Ladies of Lore out there and to reach more ears that would like to learn about these amazing women. All of the links to all of my social media and the Patreon and the Discord are in the show notes, as well as all of the other cool stuff that we spoke about in this episode. Please do check them out if you want to, but only if you want to, because you don't have to. It's okay if you don't. And I'll be back next week to unravel another thread in the rich tapestry of women in mythology and folklore.